The North Vietnamese technician stood motionless in front of the opened avionics bay, his flashlight beam fixed on something he couldn't immediately process. It was September of 1972, and the American F-5E Freedom Fighter had been on the ground near Khe Sanh for less than 48 hours. The aircraft sat intact, canopy shattered but internal systems preserved by the pilot's successful ejection sequence. What the technician saw inside that avionics compartment would trigger a cascade of events that exposed the single largest technological gap of the entire Cold War, one that Soviet military planners had systematically underestimated for more than a decade. Within 6 days, Soviet transport aircraft were loading the disassembled fighter onto pallets bound for Moscow. The fuselage sections, wings, and most critically, the complete avionics suite arrived at the Central Aero-Hydrodynamic Institute in Zhukovsky by the end of September. Senior engineers from Mikoyan, Sukhoi, and the Ministry of Radio Industry gathered in a secure hangar where the F-5E's components were laid out in systematic arrays. They had examined captured American aircraft before, dissected engines, analyzed metallurgy, photographed control systems. But when the lead avionics specialist from the Scientific Research Institute of Instrument Engineering opened the first black box and saw the circuit boards inside, he asked for the lights to be brightened. He thought his eyes were failing him. The integrated circuits were smaller than anything in the Soviet inventory by a factor of 8. The manufacturing precision suggested capabilities that Soviet lithography equipment could not achieve. The system architecture used solid-state components where Soviet designs still relied on vacuum tubes for critical functions. Every assumption about American electronic miniaturization that had guided Soviet military planning since 1965 was in that moment rendered obsolete. The engineers did not need complex testing protocols or weeks of analysis to understand the immediate implication. Within the first 2 hours of examination, they knew they were looking at technology their system could not replicate for years, possibly a decade. The Cold War had been defined by visible symbols of power, missiles that could cross continents, submarines that prowled beneath polar ice, bombers that could deliver nuclear payloads to any point on Earth. These were the instruments that dominated strategic calculations, the hardware that appeared in intelligence assessments and arms control negotiations. But the F-5E sitting in pieces in that Moscow hangar represented something more fundamental than any single weapons platform. It was physical evidence that the United States had achieved what Soviet planners considered theoretically possible but practically distant: the wholesale transformation of military aviation through microelectronics. The gap was not merely technical, it was systemic. American defense contractors had spent the previous 8 years integrating semiconductor advances into airborne systems with a speed that Soviet industrial planners had considered wasteful. The modular design philosophy that American engineers embraced, components that could be swapped in minutes rather than rebuilt over days, violated Soviet principles of ruggedization and redundancy. The F-5E's avionics weighed 62% less than equivalent Soviet systems, while performing functions that required 3 separate black boxes in MiG-21 variants. This was not incremental improvement. This was a different approach to the fundamental problem of putting information processing capability into a high-performance aircraft operating in combat conditions. Soviet engineers were not naive about American capabilities. They had tracked U.S. advances in integrated circuit production since Texas Instruments introduced the first commercial chips in 1961. Intelligence reports documented the expansion of Silicon Valley fabrication facilities throughout the 1960s. The KGB maintained active operations targeting American semiconductor companies, with priority directives to acquire manufacturing specifications and process documentation, but intelligence assessments and captured hardware produced different kinds of knowledge. Reading about 7-micron lithography standards was abstract. Holding a circuit board that used those standards to create a fire control computer smaller than a telephone directory was concrete. The examination process began with photographic documentation. Every component, every circuit board, every connector and wire bundle was catalogued with multiple angles and lighting conditions. Soviet technical photographers had developed specialized protocols for captured American equipment, using film stocks that could resolve fine detail in the etched circuits. The photography alone took 11 days. Engineers worked in shifts, maintaining controlled temperature and humidity to prevent any degradation of the sensitive electronics. They handled components with cotton gloves, aware that even skin oils could compromise later analysis. The methodical pace reflected both Soviet thoroughness and a growing sense that this examination would produce findings significant enough to justify any delay. The fire control system was analyzed first. In 1972, the standard Soviet approach to airborne fire control used analog computers with mechanical components for calculating lead angles and ballistic solutions. The MiG-21MF, the most advanced Soviet export fighter in widespread service, employed a system that weighed 41 kilograms and required extensive pre-flight calibration. The F-5Es and MABQ-159 radar and associated fire control computer weighed 18 kilograms combined and required no calibration. When Soviet engineers powered the system using a test rig that simulated aircraft electrical supply, they observed calculation speeds that their analog systems could not approach. The digital fire control computer updated targeting solutions 60 times per second. Soviet systems updated 4 times per second. The lead engineer from the Instrument Engineering Institute, a man named Konstantin Ryzhkov, who had spent 17 years designing avionics for the MiG Bureau, wrote in his preliminary assessment that the American system represented not an advantage in degree, but an advantage in kind. He noted that the solid-state construction eliminated the mechanical wear that plagued Soviet gun-laying computers. The modular architecture meant that a faulty component could be identified through built-in test equipment and replaced in under 10 minutes. Soviet systems required disassembly and bench testing to isolate failures. Ryzhkov's report concluded with a sentence that was underlined and read by 3 separate reviewing officers. He wrote that if the F-5E represented the baseline capability of American tactical aviation, then Soviet fighters were operating with a conceptual disadvantage that no amount of pilot skill could overcome in beyond visual range engagements. The communications suite revealed another dimension of American integration. The ANRAK-114 radio system used frequency synthesis rather than crystal-controlled channels. This allowed the F-5E to access 280 discrete frequencies across the VHF and UHF bands without carrying multiple crystal sets. Soviet tactical radios in 1972 typically offered 12 to 16 preset channels. Changing frequencies required physically replacing quartz crystals, a procedure that took trained technicians 20 minutes under field conditions. The American system could be reprogrammed in flight by the pilot using a control panel with digital readout. Soviet engineers testing the radio documented frequency switching times of less than 1 second with no measurable signal degradation. The implications extended beyond tactical flexibility. Soviet air defense doctrine assumed that monitoring a limited set of known NATO frequencies would provide early warning of strike package activity. The ability to rapidly shift across hundreds of channels complicated interception and jammed communications in ways that Soviet electronic warfare planning had not adequately considered. Examination team's report noted that the F-5E's communication architecture suggested a level of operational coordination that required real-time frequency management across dozens of aircraft. Simultaneously, this implied command and control systems far more sophisticated than Soviet intelligence had estimated. But it was the inertial navigation system that produced the most significant revelation. The F-5E carried a Litton LN-33 inertial navigation unit that used miniaturized gyroscopes and accelerometers to provide continuous position updates without external references. Soviet engineers were familiar with inertial navigation in principle. Soviet strategic bombers and ballistic missiles used inertial guidance systems of considerable sophistication, but those systems were large, heavy, and required extensive pre-alignment procedures. The Litton unit weighed 11 kilograms, could be aligned in under 4 minutes, and maintained accuracy within 1 nautical mile per hour of flight. The MiG-21's navigation system consisted of a magnetic compass and a radio direction finder. The chief engineer examining the inertial unit was a specialist named Viktor Petrov, who had worked on the guidance systems for the R-7 missile family. Petrov spent 3 days carefully disassembling the Litton unit, photographing each stage of the process. What he found inside violated his understanding of how miniature gyroscopes could maintain precision. The gyroscope assemblies used ball bearings with tolerances measured in millionths of an inch. The manufacturing precision required to produce such components at scale suggested an industrial base with capabilities that Soviet aerospace plants could not match. Petrov's technical assessment included detailed sketches of the bearing assemblies with notes indicating that Soviet manufacturing standards allowed tolerances an order of magnitude larger. He concluded that replicating the Litton unit would require not just new designs but entirely new production equipment. The examination revealed layers of integration that Soviet designers had not attempted. The inertial navigation system fed position data directly to the fire control computer, which used that information to calculate weapons delivery solutions. The radar system cross-referenced target tracks with navigation data to provide precise range and bearing. The communications radio could transmit encrypted position reports using data derived from the inertial unit. Everything connected to everything else through a central data bus that allowed different systems to share information without dedicated point-to-point wiring. Soviet aircraft used individual wire bundles for each connection between systems, resulting in harnesses that weighed hundreds of kilograms and required complex installation procedures. The American approach reduced weight, simplified maintenance, and enabled functionality that isolated systems could not provide. Soviet engineers documented the data bus architecture with particular attention, recognizing that this represented a fundamental philosophical difference in system design. American engineers had embraced complexity in the integration layer to enable simplicity in individual components. Soviet practice favored simple, robust individual components with minimal integration. The American method produced capabilities that Soviet methods could not easily replicate because the advantage came not from any single piece of technology but from the systematic interconnection of multiple technologies. 3 weeks into the examination, the Ministry of Aircraft Industry convened a special technical conference in Moscow. Senior designers from every major aviation bureau attended, along with representatives from the semiconductor industry and military procurement offices. The director of the Central Aero Hydrodynamic Institute, an engineer named Georgy Babakin, who had overseen the examination process, presented the findings. His briefing included photographs, circuit diagrams, weight comparisons, and performance data. He spoke for 2 hours without interruption. When he finished, the room remained silent for nearly a minute before questions began. The first question came from the chief designer at Mikoyan, who asked whether the captured aircraft might represent a specially modified version with equipment not standard on production F-5Es. Babakin replied that serial numbers on components matched known production batches, and that the aircraft's maintenance logs, also recovered, showed no unusual modifications. The equipment was standard. The second question came from a Ministry of Radio Industry official, who asked whether Soviet semiconductor plants could produce equivalent integrated circuits within 2 years if given priority allocation of resources. Babakin consulted with Konstantin Razkov before answering. He said that producing circuits with similar density was theoretically possible, but that matching the reliability standards evident in the American components would require solving multiple materials science problems that Soviet research had not yet addressed. A deputy defense minister attended the briefing, a man who rarely involved himself in technical details, but whose presence indicated Kremlin-level interest. He asked a question that cut through the technical discussion. He wanted to know whether the capabilities demonstrated by the F-5E electronics were representative of all American tactical aircraft, or whether this was an exceptional case. Babakin answered carefully. He explained that intelligence reports indicated the F-5E was considered a simplified, export-oriented fighter in American service. The electronics suite was derived from systems used in the F-4 Phantom, which had been operational since 1960. If the F-5E represented baseline capability, then frontline American aircraft, like the new F-14 Tomcat and F-15 Eagle, carried avionics generations ahead of anything Soviet engineers had examined. The deputy minister asked one more question. He wanted to know the timeline for achieving parity. Babakin looked at his notes, then at the assembled engineers, before providing an answer that was recorded in multiple memoirs written decades later. He said that matching the specific capabilities of the F-5E avionics suite would require between 5 and 7 years, assuming immediate reallocation of resources and successful resolution of manufacturing challenges. Matching the capabilities of current-generation American frontline fighters would require longer, possibly 10 to 12 years. Achieving not just parity, but the integration philosophy that made American systems more capable than the sum of their parts would require changes to Soviet design culture and procurement practices that he could not predict a timeline for. The implications reached beyond aviation. Soviet military doctrine in 1972 emphasized quantitative superiority, the ability to produce aircraft, tanks, and artillery in numbers that could overwhelm NATO forces through sheer volume of fire. This approach assumed rough qualitative parity in major systems. Individual American tanks or aircraft might have marginal advantages, but Soviet numbers would compensate. The F-5E examination suggested that American advantages were not marginal and that they derived from industrial and technological capabilities that could not be simply copied or stolen. the advantage came from an entire ecosystem of research institutions, private companies, and military procurement systems that had been developing together for decades. Soviet intelligence agencies had devoted enormous resources to acquiring American technology throughout the Cold War. The KGB's Directorate T, responsible for scientific and technical intelligence, operated networks across the United States and Western Europe specifically targeting defense contractors and research laboratories. These operations produced genuine successes. Soviet engineers had access to detailed specifications for American jet engines, copied designs for air-to-air missiles, and obtained manufacturing documentation for various electronic components. But having documentation and being able to replicate at scale were different challenges. The problem was not simply industrial capacity. The Soviet Union could produce steel, aluminum, and titanium in vast quantities. Soviet rocket engines were in many ways superior to American designs, more efficient, more powerful per unit of weight. Soviet theoretical mathematics and physics research was world-class, producing insights that American scientists studied carefully. But the translation of scientific knowledge into mass-produced, reliable, miniaturized components required a kind of precision manufacturing culture that Soviet central planning had not successfully cultivated. American defense contractors operated in a competitive environment where companies that could not meet reliability standards lost contracts to competitors. Soviet defense plants operated under plans that measured success by units produced, not by mean time between failures. The examination of the F-5E forced a confrontation with this systemic reality. The Soviet engineers who analyzed the avionics were not lacking in skill or understanding. They could comprehend the design principles, appreciate the engineering elegance, and identify the specific advantages each component provided. What they could not immediately do was replicate the manufacturing processes that made those components possible at acceptable cost and reliability. American integrated circuits achieved their small size through photolithography techniques that required extraordinarily clean fabrication environments, measured in particles per cubic meter of air. Soviet semiconductor plants in 1972 operated in environments with contamination levels 2 orders of magnitude higher than American facilities. The Ministry of Electronics Industry received a classified report in October of 1972 outlining the steps necessary to match American semiconductor capabilities. The recommendations included construction of new fabrication facilities with advanced cleanroom technology, development of new photoresist chemicals, acquisition of precision optical systems for lithography equipment, and training programs for thousands of technicians. The estimated cost was substantial, equivalent to approximately 12% of the annual Soviet defense budget. The timeline assumed no major technical setbacks and successful acquisition of certain Western manufacturing equipment through covert channels. Even under optimistic assumptions, the report concluded that Soviet production of integrated circuits comparable to what the F-5E carried would not reach significant scale before 1980. Meanwhile, American aircraft production continued without interruption. The F-15 Eagle entered service with the United States Air Force in 1974, carrying an avionics suite that made the F-5E's electronics look primitive. The F-14 Tomcat, operational with the Navy in the same year, featured the AWG-9 radar system capable of tracking 24 targets simultaneously and engaging 6. Soviet fighters in 1974 could track 1 target at a time. The technology gap was not narrowing, it was widening. Soviet responses came in multiple forms. The military procurement system placed new emphasis on avionics development, redirecting resources from other programs. Design bureaus received directives to prioritize solid-state electronics and modular architecture in new aircraft. The Ministry of Electronics Industry launched crash programs to improve semiconductor manufacturing, but these responses operated within constraints that limited their effectiveness. Soviet economic planning operated on 5-year cycles that could not easily accommodate rapid technological shifts. The bureaucratic structure that had successfully built massive quantities of conventional weapons could not pivot quickly to precision electronics manufacturing. Individual Soviet aircraft designers made creative attempts to compensate for electronic limitations. The MiG-23, entering widespread service in the mid-1970s, incorporated some solid-state components and a more capable radar than previous Soviet fighters. But the avionics suite still weighed significantly more than American equivalents and offered less functionality. The So-27, designed in response to the F-15, would not reach operational service until 1985, more than a decade after its American counterpart. Even then, Soviet engineers acknowledged privately that the avionics represented their best effort, but did not achieve true parity with American systems. The human dimension of this technological confrontation manifested in the experiences of Soviet fighter pilots who encountered American aircraft in proxy conflicts. In the Middle East, where Soviet-supplied fighters flown by Arab air forces faced American-supplied Israeli aircraft, the electronic advantage translated into consistent tactical victories. Israeli F-4Es and later F-15Es and F-16Es could detect, track and engage Arab MiGs before Soviet radars acquired their targets. Soviet training emphasized visual combat and close-range tactics because that remained the domain where superior Soviet maneuverability and pilot skill could potentially overcome electronic disadvantages. But American doctrine increasingly emphasized beyond visual range combat, using radar-guided missiles to destroy enemy aircraft before they could close to visual range. This approach transformed air combat from a test of individual pilot skill into a contest of system capability. The better radar, the more reliable missile, the more effective electronic countermeasures, these factors determined outcomes before human reflexes and training could make a difference. Soviet pilots trained to fight at close range found themselves dying at long range, killed by missiles launched from aircraft they never saw. The examination of the F-5E became a reference point in Soviet military planning discussions throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. When design bureaus proposed new aircraft, evaluation committees asked whether avionics would match American standards. When budget allocations were debated, advocates for electronics investment cited the F-5E findings. The captured aircraft served as a tangible reminder that American technological advantages were real, measurable, and consequential. It was not propaganda or intelligence speculation. It was hardware that Soviet engineers had taken apart with their own hands and measured with their own instruments. The broader Cold War competition included domains where Soviet capabilities matched or exceeded American performance. Soviet ballistic missiles were generally larger and more powerful than American equivalents. Soviet tank production outpaced American output by significant margins. Soviet air defense systems, particularly the SA-2 and later SA-6, proved effective against American aircraft in Vietnam and the Middle East. But these successes existed in domains where size, quantity, and brute force effectiveness mattered more than miniaturization and electronic sophistication. The shift toward electronics-dependent military systems played to American industrial strengths. The United States had developed the world's most advanced commercial electronics industry, driven by consumer demand and competitive innovation. Transistor radios, television sets, early computers, these products created a manufacturing ecosystem that defense contractors could tap into. Soviet electronics production remained concentrated in military applications, without the commercial market forces that drove American innovation and scale. This meant that American military electronics benefited from advances developed for civilian markets, while Soviet military electronics operated in relative isolation. By the early 1980s, Soviet military journals began publishing articles that obliquely acknowledged the challenge. Authors with technical backgrounds wrote about the need to embrace radio-electronic combat as a distinct domain of warfare. These articles described scenarios where victory would depend on superior radar, communications, and electronic warfare systems rather than traditional factors like firepower or maneuverability. The articles never explicitly stated that the Soviet Union was behind in these capabilities, but the emphasis on future needs implied current deficiencies. The decision to examine the captured F-5E so thoroughly and to circulate the findings so widely within the Soviet defense establishment reflected a degree of intellectual honesty about American capabilities. Soviet military planners could have dismissed the evidence, attributed American advantages to temporary factors, or claimed that Soviet systems possessed compensating advantages. Some officials made these arguments, but the engineers who examined the aircraft did not have that luxury. They saw the circuit boards, measured the components, tested the systems. The evidence was physical and irrefutable. Konstantin Ryzhkov, the lead avionics specialist, wrote a classified technical paper in 1974 that was circulated among senior design bureau engineers. The paper compared Soviet and American approaches to airborne electronics across multiple generations of aircraft. Ryzhkov documented a consistent pattern: American systems achieving greater functionality with lower weight and higher reliability through aggressive adoption of new semiconductor technologies. He noted that Soviet systems often demonstrated impressive capability when first introduced, but aged poorly as electronics continued advancing. A Soviet fighter designed in 1965 might be competitive with American aircraft of that era, But by 1970, the American aircraft would have received multiple avionics upgrades while the Soviet fighter retained its original systems. This pattern reflected different procurement philosophies. American military services regularly funded midlife upgrades for aircraft, installing new radars, updated computers, and improved electronic warfare equipment. Soviet practice emphasized building large numbers of aircraft to a fixed standard, with upgrades occurring only during major overhaul cycles. The American approach allowed continuous capability enhancement. The Soviet approach locked in technological standards for years at a time. The economic implications of the electronics gap extended beyond military applications. Soviet leadership recognized that the same semiconductor technologies providing American military advantages were also driving Western economic productivity. Personal computers, industrial automation, telecommunications, all depended on integrated circuits that Soviet industry could not produce at competitive quality or cost. The military technology gap was symptomatic of a broader industrial technology gap that threatened Soviet economic competitiveness. Efforts to acquire Western technology intensified throughout the late 1970s. KGB operations targeting Silicon Valley companies increased in scope and sophistication. The Soviet Union established front companies in Western Europe to legally purchase embargoed equipment. Scientific exchange programs were exploited to gather technical intelligence. These efforts produced some successes but could not overcome the fundamental challenge that stealing designs did not transfer manufacturing capability. Having blueprints for an advanced semiconductor fabrication facility did not provide the expertise to operate one successfully. The F-5E itself, after examination concluded, was partially reassembled and placed in storage at a restricted facility outside Moscow. The avionics components were retained separately for ongoing study. Some circuit boards were destructively analyzed, sliced into thin sections for microscopic examination of internal structures. Others were kept intact for testing and training purposes. Soviet electronics engineers in the late 1970s could request access to examine specific components, using the captured hardware as a physical reference for their own design work. Several Soviet aircraft that entered service in the 1980s showed clear influence from the F-5E examination. The MiG-29, designed as a lightweight fighter roughly analogous to the American F-16, incorporated modular avionics architecture and solid-state components throughout. The Su-27 featured a fire control system that, while still larger and heavier than American equivalents, represented a significant advance over previous Soviet practice. These aircraft demonstrated that Soviet engineers could learn from American examples and implement improved designs. But the implementations came years after American aircraft with similar capabilities entered service, and the persistent weight and reliability gaps indicated that manufacturing limitations remained. The psychological impact on Soviet military personnel who understood the technology gap varied by individual. Some engineers felt frustration at constraints beyond their control, aware they possessed the theoretical knowledge to design advanced systems but lacked the manufacturing tools to build them. Some pilots experienced fatalism about facing American aircraft, recognizing that no amount of training could overcome fundamental system disadvantages. Some procurement officials became advocates for radical reform of Soviet military-industrial practices, arguing that incremental improvements would never achieve parity. Others maintained that Soviet advantages in other domains compensated for electronic shortcomings. Larger numbers of aircraft, longer-range missiles, more powerful radars even if less sophisticated, these factors were emphasized by those who resisted acknowledgement of American superiority. The debate played out in classified briefings, technical journals, and procurement decisions throughout the 1980s. The F-5E examination provided empirical grounding for those arguing that electronics had become the critical domain of military competition. American intelligence agencies were aware that the Soviets had acquired the F-5E and conducted detailed examination. The loss of any advanced military equipment to potential adversaries triggered immediate assessment of compromised capabilities and potential countermeasures. In this case, however, American planners concluded that Soviet knowledge of F-5E electronics, while unfortunate, did not significantly compromise U.S. capabilities. The aircraft represented technology from the mid-1960s. By the mid-1970s, when Soviet analysis was occurring, American frontline aircraft had moved well beyond those capabilities. The incident reinforced American confidence in a strategy of technological superiority. Rather than attempting to match Soviet numerical advantages in conventional forces, the United States would maintain qualitative edges that multiplied the effectiveness of smaller numbers. One American fighter with superior avionics could engage multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously. One reconnaissance aircraft with advanced sensors could collect intelligence that required dozens of conventional platforms. This approach required continuous investment in research and development, but it played to American industrial strengths. The examination of the F-5E represented a moment of clarity about the nature of late Cold War military competition. Brute force industrial capacity remained important, but increasingly the decisive factor was information processing capability. Sensors that could detect and track threats at greater ranges, computers that could calculate targeting solutions faster and more accurately, communication systems that could coordinate complex operations in real time. These capabilities determine tactical outcomes. The United States had built an industrial ecosystem capable of rapid innovation in these domains. The Soviet Union had not, and the centralized planning system that had successfully industrialized a primarily agricultural economy proved less effective at fostering the kind of distributed innovation that electronics advancement required. Soviet engineers who examined the F-5E in 1972 could not have predicted that the Soviet Union would cease to exist less than 20 years later. The technology gap they documented was not the sole cause of Soviet dissolution, but it was symptomatic of deeper systemic challenges. An economy that could not produce reliable consumer electronics at scale struggled to compete in an increasingly information-dependent world. Military forces that could not match American electronics capabilities faced increasing disadvantages in any potential conflict. The psychological impact of recognizing that a rival power had achieved sustainable technological superiority contributed to a broader loss of confidence in Soviet system viability. The individual engineers who spent weeks disassembling and analyzing the captured fighter did not think in grand strategic terms while conducting their work. They measured voltages, traced circuits, calculated tolerances. They were technicians doing technical work, but their findings accumulated into a portrait of American industrial capability that challenged fundamental Soviet assumptions. The careful documentation they produced, the photographs and measurements and test results, became evidence in a larger argument about the trajectory of the Cold War competition. Decades after the examination, some of the engineers involved spoke publicly about the experience. Viktor Petrov, the inertial navigation specialist, gave an interview to a Russian aviation journal in 2003. He described the moment when he first opened the Litton navigation unit and realized the precision of the gyroscope assemblies. He said he experienced a strange mixture of admiration for the engineering and disappointment that Soviet industry could not replicate it. He emphasized that this was not about American engineers being more intelligent or creative. It was about an industrial system that could translate design concepts into reliable, mass-produced hardware. That capability, he said, was what the Cold War ultimately measured. The F-5E Freedom Fighter was not the most advanced American aircraft of its era. It was designed as an affordable, reliable fighter for export and training purposes. The designation Freedom Fighter was a marketing term aimed at Allied nations purchasing American military equipment. The aircraft emphasized simplicity, ease of maintenance, and cost-effectiveness over cutting-edge performance. Yet, this baseline, export-oriented fighter carried avionics that Soviet engineers recognized as superior to anything in their own advanced fighter inventory. That recognition was the revelation that mattered. In the years following the examination, Soviet intelligence services acquired additional American aircraft components through various means: shot down aircraft in the Middle East, defecting pilots, covert purchases through intermediaries. Each acquisition provided additional data points, and each confirmed the initial findings from the F-5E examination. American electronics were smaller, lighter, more reliable, and more capable across every category of airborne system. The consistency of this advantage across different aircraft types and different time periods indicated that it was not a matter of individual design decisions, but of systemic capability. The Soviet response to this challenge was constrained by factors beyond simple technological knowledge. The centralized economy struggled to allocate resources efficiently for rapidly evolving technology sectors. The security-obsessed bureaucracy slowed information sharing between different design bureaus and research institutions. The emphasis on quantitative production metrics discouraged the kind of quality-focused manufacturing culture that semiconductor fabrication required. These structural factors meant that even when Soviet engineers understood what needed to be done, implementing those solutions at scale proved difficult. American engineers were not universally brilliant, and American military programs were not free from waste or misjudgment. The F-111 program experienced significant technical problems. The A-12 stealth aircraft was cancelled after cost overruns. Various missile and radar programs failed to meet performance targets. But the overall ecosystem of competitive contractors, rigorous testing, and quality-focused procurement produced a consistent pattern of technological advancement. Individual failures occurred within a system that corrected mistakes and incorporated lessons learned. Soviet military aviation achieved genuine successes throughout the Cold War. The MiG-25 Foxbat could fly faster and higher than any American fighter when it was introduced. The SA-2 surface-to-air missile forced American bombers to abandon high-altitude tactics and develop entirely new operational concepts. Soviet tank designs influenced Western armor development, but these successes existed alongside persistent shortcomings in areas where electronics and precision manufacturing determined capability. The examination of the F-5E provided quantitative documentation of those shortcomings in a way that abstract intelligence assessments could not match. Soviet military planners could debate the significance of classified American research programs or the capabilities of aircraft they had never seen. They could not debate the measurements taken from hardware sitting in their own laboratory. The empirical evidence forced a degree of intellectual honesty that strategic competition often lacked. By the mid-1980s, Soviet military journals were publishing articles that acknowledged the challenge more directly. Authors described the need for a revolution in military affairs centered on information systems and precision-guided weapons. These articles recognized that future warfare would be decided by the ability to detect, identify, and engage targets at long range using networked sensors and weapons. The American military was already implementing this vision through programs like AWACS airborne radar, precision-guided munitions, and data-linked tactical aircraft. Soviet forces were attempting to develop similar capabilities but remained years behind in implementation. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 ended the institutional competition that had driven decades of military technological rivalry. The Russian military forces that emerged from the dissolution inherited vast quantities of Soviet-era equipment, including thousands of aircraft designed to confront American air power. But they also inherited the industrial and technological limitations that the F-5E examination had revealed nearly 20 years earlier. Russian defense industries in the 1990s struggled with funding, brain drain, and obsolete manufacturing equipment. The technology gap, already significant in the 1970s, widened further. In the 21st century, Russian aircraft designers have continued attempting to achieve parity with American avionics. The Su-35 and Su-57 incorporate advanced electronic systems that represent significant improvements over Soviet-era aircraft. But assessments by independent analysts and statements by Russian military officials acknowledge that these aircraft still lag behind American F-22 and F-35 capabilities in key areas of sensor fusion and electronic warfare. The legacy of industrial and technological constraints that the F-5E examination revealed continues to influence Russian military capabilities decades later. The story of Soviet engineers examining a captured American fighter represents more than a technical intelligence operation. It was a moment when quantitative evidence confronted systemic assumptions. The engineers who conducted the examination were skilled professionals doing careful technical work. Their findings were not influenced by political pressure or wishful thinking. They measured what was there and documented what those measurements meant. That documentation became part of a larger realization within Soviet military and political leadership that American technological advantages were real, significant, and difficult to overcome. The Cold War was ultimately decided by multiple factors: economic, political, social, and military. But the technology gap revealed by the F-5E examination was symptomatic of broader systemic differences between American and Soviet approaches to innovation, manufacturing, and quality. The same factors that allowed American defense contractors to produce superior avionics also enabled American consumer electronics companies to dominate global markets. The same centralized planning that constrained Soviet semiconductor development also contributed to chronic consumer goods shortages and economic stagnation. The individual engineers who spent September and October of 1972 disassembling an American fighter in a Moscow hangar were not thinking about the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were analyzing circuit boards, measuring components, testing systems. But their work documented a technological reality that had strategic consequences. American industrial capability in electronics and precision manufacturing had created military advantages that Soviet central planning could not efficiently counter. That realization, replicated across multiple domains of military technology throughout the 1970s and 80s, contributed to a broader loss of confidence in Soviet system viability that became apparent by the end of the decade. The F-5E freedom fighter flew combat missions, trained pilots, and served in air forces around the world for decades. But its most significant contribution to American Cold War success might have been sitting disassembled in a Soviet research facility, providing undeniable evidence of technological superiority that no amount of political rhetoric could dismiss. Soviet engineers examined that aircraft with professional thoroughness and reported their findings with technical accuracy. Those findings told a story about industrial capability, system integration, and manufacturing precision that illuminated the trajectory of the late Cold War competition more clearly than any intelligence estimate or political analysis. If you found value in understanding how technological advantages shaped Cold War outcomes, consider subscribing for more detailed explorations of the intelligence operations, engineering achievements, and strategic decisions that defined the American-Soviet rivalry. This channel focuses on the documented evidence, the human reactions, and the systemic factors that explain why certain capabilities mattered when they did.